Hey everyone, and welcome to Volume 4 of Horror Stories to Help You Sleep. Tonight we have 8 stories coming out to just over 2 hours. I hope you all enjoy them. If you do, please be sure to drop a like rating as it helps out the channel immensely. Let's see if we can reach 1,500 likes. I think if everybody left a like, we could do it. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated, as I post content just like this all of the time. Also, today is my 26th birthday, so if you want to get me a birthday present, reaching those 1,500 likes would be pretty cool. Anyway, enjoy the stories, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Good night, everybody. Every town has a legend, a haunted house, an abandoned mill, an apparition that appears by a bridge. Myths and legends are symbiotic with the Midwest, and every town I've lived in had one or two peculiar locations that leave you scratching your head. Usually, these stories seem to spawn as an effect of another reason. In the case of the town I lived in Colorado, the tales of a haunted grain factory seem like an attempt to keep a relic of the town's history relevant. Then, when I moved to Utah, the story of a Main Street wraith probably spawned as a talking point in a sparsely populated town because, well, to be honest, there isn't much of anything interesting going on in the Utah desert. Then I moved to the middle of an Arizona desert and learned of the local town's weird legend. It started 4 years ago. A man by the name of Jeffrey Willard came home late one day after delivering parcels, grabbed a hammer from his shed, and mercilessly beat his wife and dog to death. Nobody in town knows why. When the police found him, he was sitting on his porch peacefully. He didn't even know what happened. Yet, when they went inside, they were horrified at what they saw. Supposedly, Jeff was emotionless, telling the police he didn't remember anything about the night or why he did what he did. It didn't take long for the coroner to piece together what had happened. The evidence was clear. Willard was a murderer. A local friend by the name of Dwayne Eulis, who was the responding officer that night, refused to talk about his experiences that evening. While I was moving in, Dwayne helped me and my wife get acquainted with the town, and as a result, we've become good friends. We've talked a lot about each other's lives, my own experiences in the police force, and I learned a lot about him from his stories, both funny and mundane. One evening, he briefly mentioned the Willard murder, and I asked him to tell me more about it. He outright refused. I understand why, too. If you've never lived in a small community, it's hard to know how violent a crime can change things. He did make one brief note, however, which was this. Jeffrey Willard was a standout man who loved his wife and loved God. He never would have done something so heinous unless something had caused him to go mad. Despite Eulis' refusal to recount his story, it didn't take long to fill in more gaps as it was a common talking point in the local bar, even 4 years later. Everything anyone's ever said was that he was a normal man living a normal life, and the morning of the murder, nothing was out of the ordinary. He went to work, seemed peaceful and amiable, and appeared normal until he wasn't seen until after the murder. There was no sensible rationalization for why he did what he did. The only one who had any sort of insight was the local barkeep, Tom Davis, who recounted his experience the night of the murder to me many times. Per his story, he was closing the bar when he saw Willard's headlights coming in from the desert from the west. As he says, I already knew something strange was going on when I saw someone coming down Reverie Road during that night. Willard drove by the bar, and as Tom says, it was like he was entranced. He was driving slowly, ignoring stop signs and traffic lines. As he drove by, Davis says that he got a glimpse of Willard's face. To this day, Davis insists that there was no life in the man's eyes as he drove by. That brings me to the subject of my town's local oddity, Reverie Road. On the west side of town, there is a road that begins between the gas station and the bar. It starts by the gas station and goes straight into the desert. Nobody has any idea where it goes. There are no houses in the direction it heads off to. There are no towns. There are no lakes, no mines, no rivers. There are no hotels, schools, gas stations, telephone lines, windmill farms, power plants, landfills, cattle ranches. The road does not have a highway marker. It does not even have marks in the pavement. Reverie Road is an enigma. The road does not go anywhere, but has been here even before the town. Well, why not drive down it and see where it goes? I've asked. Everyone in the community has their own story about how they tried, yet every attempt ended in failure. As it turns out, if you decide to turn into Reverie Road, you will find yourself at an embankment after about 3 miles. There is a bridge that crosses this embankment, but it has fallen apart. When this was, nobody has any idea. However, crossing this trench is impossible with a motor vehicle, so nobody has been able to see where exactly the road ends. You can probably see how the murder and road's peculiar nature muddled together to form a local legend. People began to speculate. What was Willard doing on that road that night? What caused him to have an episode of extreme violence? Was it possible that something on the road provoked Willard to kill his family? Theories began to abound. One week, Reverie Road led to an ancient burial ground. Next week, the road was inhabited by skinwalkers. Some think that maybe there's a government mind-bending facility, or even Area 51. Maybe Willard had an encounter with aliens. Maybe at the end of the road, there's a cult of cannibal hillbillies, or a chemical plant that produces a toxin that turns the rabbits gay. More logical conclusions abound certainly, but even those hardly make any sense. The local area has no natural resources to mine for, and there never were plans on having a town in that direction considering it was off the path of an already established highway. There are no bodies of water, and the land is not arable. There is no consensus on where this road goes, and hardly any history on its construction. The only thing that is certain is that if you stand on the edge of the dilapidated bridge, Reverie Road continues on indefinitely into the desert to a destination that is impossible to know. A few curious adventurers have tried to find out where the road goes. However, the Arizona desert is harsh and, as established, you can't drive past the embankment. So after months of speculation and a little bit of exploration, an urban myth was born. There's a mysterious road in the desert, and a man drove down it and came back and killed his wife and dog. Insert your own reason why. Eventually, time eroded the myth, and people began to forget about Reverie Road again. The story of Willard's violent act silently became a bruise in the town's history. Life began to return to normal, and only fragments of the original fascination with the street remained. There were still believers, but for the most part, nobody cared to speculate further. Reverie Road was just a road. That was until yesterday morning. There's no way to cut to this. I was minding my business, filling my car up at the gas station. It was a typical Monday morning. My wife was chilling in the passenger seat when she suddenly tapped on the window and pointed out into the desert. I turned towards the road and quickly saw a shape moving towards the town. I watched as it drew nearer, and eventually those that were nearby stopped what they were doing to see this mysterious figure emerging from the desert. Soon the shape came into focus as it got closer. It was a man limping, and he was dragging something behind him. As it got closer, I could hear my wife scream from inside the car, and my heart dropped. It was Tom Davis, the barkeep. He was shambling up Reverie Road, a chain wrapped around his torso as he walked laboriously towards us. Behind him, something heavy dragged on the pavement, streaked it red. I ran up to him, the small crowd of people coming with me. I called out Tom's name, but he did not respond, instead continuing to move forward. Then, when we were no farther out than a few meters, I stopped and I could feel my body freeze. Tom Davis was dragging his dead son behind him. The crowd stopped moving. In the Arizona heat, I could feel goosebumps form. I stood awestruck as I watched the details slowly emerge. Tom's torso was bloodied and his clothes were ripped, exposing deep wounds. The chain that surrounded him was the same chain he usually had in the back of his truck, the one he volunteered to people when they needed to tow something. It was tightly wrapped around his son's neck. The teen's blue face squeezed violently as his eyes were nearly popped out of their sockets. Further, it was evident that the teen's arms had been broken in numerous places as bones protruded from his skin. Tom's face was blank. Despite the oppressive sunburn he had acquired, his lips were dry and peeling. As he got closer to the intersection, his face began to show more signs of lucidity, before finally erupting into a confounding blabber as he stopped off the road. What? Someone ran inside the gas station grabbing a bottle of water. People surrounded Tom, and screams filled the air as people began to see the condition of his son. What happened? Then, slowly, Tom turned around and let out a shriveled scream as he saw what he was dragging. I told my wife to drive home, and the police were immediately called. People started moving away from Tom, watching in silent horror as it appeared he regained consciousness. He dropped to the pavement, crying into the air and screaming louder than any man I had ever heard scream. I watched a father hastily try to remove the chains off his dead son. I watched a father try to administer CPR. I watched a father endlessly call out his son's name, and I finally watched a father hold his son's corpse as his wails were not returned. I could only stand with a stiff hand covering my mouth, keeping my distance from the scene as I had realized what I was witnessing. Sirens blared from the distance, and in no time, Officer Euless stepped out of his cruiser, placed his hat to his chest, and covered his mouth in horror. The officer stood there, shaking, unable to move. I watched his knees wobble before he turned around to the cruiser, nearly falling against the door. After a few minutes of abject panicking, he calmed himself before approaching Tom slowly. Tom Davis was apprehended. The body was examined by the responding officers. Nobody had a question about what happened. It appeared that Tom Davis beat and choked his son to death. And within the hour, the legend of Reverie Road returned. After Tom was apprehended, Officer Euless organized a search party to find their vehicle and Tom's wife, as well as any supporting evidence about what might have happened. I volunteered, as did many of the townspeople, to help. Businesses closed as the community gathered at the edge of the road to help in the search. People began to speak as we began to walk into the desert. This was just like the Willard murder. The road turned him mad too. Why would he do this? The most common question churning through everyone's mind was, why? So we walked down Reverie Road in a line to find out. We combed the desert for tracks or any sort of clues as to what went on. We found no tire tracks or other evidence that Tom's truck went off the path. We found no footprints, no clothing, no weapons, no sign of a struggle. The search was beginning to appear fruitless. Then we made it to the dilapidated bridge. The bridge was still broken apart in the middle as anyone would come to expect, but something caught us by surprise. Tom's truck was on the other side of the trench. There was no evidence he drove into the trench. The ground and dry brush was undisturbed. Instead, it appeared as if he somehow drove over the bridge. Weirder yet, the white Ford was still running, as if it had been suddenly abandoned. One of the tires was flat with a knife sticking out of it, as if sabotaged. The ground surrounding the vehicle was disturbed, and blood painted the windows and hood. I heard a woman from beside me sputter around, pointing at the side of the car. Oh my God. I looked to see what she was pointing at, and I quickly pulled her away as I covered my eyes. There was a hand dangling from inside the car, blood dripping down the arm. Officer Eulis called in that they found Tom's wife shortly after. Then, without pause, I saw him turn to us, terror in his eyes and his mouth shaking. He told us we should turn around and that the search was concluded. On the way back, nobody spoke to each other. Last night I went to go drink. I think after everything I had seen, I needed it. There were more people at the bar than usual. Good for them. There was a heavy air as one of Tom's friends was managing for the night, and he acted solemnly and talked very little, only servicing people's requests. Surprisingly, Eulis showed up as well. He was still in uniform and sat in the corner without talking to much of anyone. After an hour of talking with some of the other locals, I decided to check up on him to make sure he was alright. He saw me approach, nodded, and stared out the window at the road that goes into the desert. I sat down, prying my eyes to see what he was looking at. Eventually I spoke. "You alright?" He stiffened up, laid back in his chair, and nodded. "Yeah, He paused. "Yeah." I ordered a drink for both of us, and I brought the topic to the Cardinals and their current season. Eulis seemed mildly interested, but the conversation didn't go anywhere. I was prepared to leave, to give him some time, but then Eulis surprised me. "The night of the Willard murder, He sighed, gathering his thoughts, then continued. "Well, you know I don't like talking about that night." "You don't have to," I assured him. "No, I think I do." At that moment, I saw a level of conviction on his face and determination to power through what reservations he had about the topic. I need to tell someone. "Well, I'm all ears." That night that we found Willard's wife, I remember distinctly how horrific and brutally merciless the crime scene was. I mean, Christ. One morning you've got this man and his loving wife, and by the next, she was barely recognizable. Nobody had any idea what could cause that man to... He choked for a bit before continuing. "And so I asked around the town about the local gossip, to see if I could piece together an affair or a motive. There was none, and Willard himself was so confused as we were. But then Tom told me about the night he saw Willard return from the desert on Reverie Road, and Eulis began to hold his hands tight to his mouth. A look of anguish splashed against his now reddening complexion. "I drove down it." I waited for him to continue. "What did you see?" His eyes looked at me and spoke straight and without hesitation. "Nothing. There is nothing down that road, you understand?" I nodded. "I understand." He turned over his shoulder, at the crowd on the other side of the bar who were oblivious to the conversation. He glanced back at me, bringing his face close to the center of the table before whispering, "What I tell you next stays with us, you hear?" I nodded again. When I came back from the road that night, I began to have nightmares. I could feel the sweat in my palms and the anxiety in my limbs. In the entire time I've known Euless, I had never known him to be anything but level-headed. I was beginning to believe that the trauma of the morning had caused something inside him to finally come out, a side that I had never seen. Nightmares. About? I had nightmares that I drove past the bridge. I took a drink from my glass, not sure what to say. At first hearing, it didn't seem strange that he dreamed about the road after filling his mind with thoughts. But there was one word that stuck out to me. He said nightmares. What was on the other side? I don't remember. I never remember, but I could see tears forming in his eyes. I dreamed I was Willard that night, that I was the one with the hammer, and I was the one who... He paused, recollecting himself once more. I dreamed that I did what Willard did. I placed my hand on his wrist. You had a nightmare after a traumatic event. There's nothing abnormal about that. No, he said. No, it wasn't just a normal dream. It was, I said. You shouldn't feel guilty about what happened. It's not anyone's fault but Willard's. I had another one last night and it wasn't about Willard. I froze. You're not saying... I am. He said, nodding slowly. Tom? I saw it all. I was Tom Davis in my dream. I saw the man and his family take a turn on the road. I saw him drive through the dark desert. I saw him approach the bridge and... He gulped. When he was on the other side, I saw what weapon he used on the son. I saw what he did to the wife. My mouth was agape. I didn't know what to say. Euless was letting tears stream down his face at this point, and I sat silently. You didn't see the wife's body, he continued, but I did, and it was exactly as Tom left it, weapon and all. Another long pause. Then he started yelling through his tears. How can someone do those things to another person? People in the bar stopped talking, turning their head in our direction. I could have stopped him. I saw it coming, damn it. Christ, I could have stopped it from happening. I wanted to try and calm him down. Try and tell him there was nothing he could have done. Instead, I sat silently taking in everything that I heard. The conversation turned back to other things, and I tried my best to keep his mind off of whatever was eating at him. We only hung around for another hour before finally the bar closed and I wished him a farewell. He bid me an adieu, a faint optimism that maybe everything was going to be fine. I knew deep down that he wasn't going to sleep that night. So I got to my car and began driving out of the bar lot. Not long after, I made it to the stoplight at the intersection with Reverie Road. The air was warm and still, and as I waited for the light to turn green, my eyes went to the dark road that drifted into the vast desert. The streetlights illuminated the entrance, but that was it. Reverie Road was shrouded in black. I turned my gaze back to the street ahead of me, staring at the main streets ahead, continuing my wait as the light was still red. Then, like a magnet, my eyes went back towards the Reverie Road, its draw overpowering and the allure indisputable. I began to wonder, how much could it hurt to go down this road real quick, to see if I could find something myself. It was pulling my focus, and all I could wonder was, what was down there? Nothing. That's what Euless had said. There's nothing down that road, you understand? There was something. I could already feel it. The road was sucking me in. A car honked behind me and I looked back up to the traffic light. It was green. Without hesitation, I put my turn signal on, turned up my headlights, and turned onto Reverie Road. I drove into the desert, carefully and slowly. I had my brights on, the wheels of my car dipping and rising with the imperfect asphalt. The stars above me were faint and the desert around me was infinite. The darkness of night was swallowing me whole as I drove deeper. All the while, I kept thinking to myself, there's nothing down this road. This is stupid. I should turn back. I was 2 miles in. There was no turning back. The loneliness was unmistakable. It felt like I was the only living thing for hundreds of miles, and even the light of the town behind me was fleeting. I turned the radio up for some company, but eventually faded to static. It was strange, but I knew there were cold spots that the local radio tower didn't reach. Then I made it 3 miles in. I slammed on my brakes. I heard the tires under the car screech and I was kicked forward in my seat. My headlights illuminated the sight before me and I could feel my breathing become labored. I sat motionless and I must have been wide-eyed as a deer caught in my headlights. I began to shake and I knew that something was wrong. The bridge before me was intact. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel. Impossible. With my car still running, I stepped out of the driver's side, placing my foot on the asphalt underneath. Without removing my gaze, I eyed the bridge before me. Tom's truck was still on the other side, abandoned and lifeless, still covered in blood. I stepped forward to the edge of the bridge. The road continued into an abyss of darkness stretched out before me and the headlights. I began to feel a breeze pulling me in. It would be so easy to step forward, to traverse the bridge and make it to the other side. I could finally find out where the road went. I stood, continuing to stare into the darkness when I saw 2 lights come on far ahead. They were like 2 pinpoints, miles down the road. They weren't moving. They looked almost like headlights, but I already knew there was nobody on the road. Another thought popped in my mind. They almost looked like eyes. The curiosity was too great. I had only goal to cross the bridge and walk into the desert. I had no other drive, no other motivation. I was going to know where it ended, and I was going to know tonight. As I stood before the bridge, placing my foot forward, it was almost like I began to dream. I dreamed about walking down the road. I dreamed that I made it to the end. I dreamed about crossing the bridge once more, making it back to town. I dreamed that I went to my garage. I grabbed a drill. I dreamed that I opened the door to my bedroom and flicked the lights on as I gripped the drill tightly, the bit spinning loudly as I stepped forward. I dreamed that my wife turned to me, fear washing over her face, and she screamed. I dreamed. No! I woke up panting. The sound of a drill ringing in my ears as I flailed around in the darkness of the desert. My eyes quickly adjusted back to the landscape around me, and I was back in the real world, standing on the bridge. The car was still running behind me. Sweat dripped down my face, and I was shaking as I crawled back to my car, put it into reverse, turned it around, and drove as fast as I could back to town. I have no idea how long I was out there for. The sun was beginning to come up over the horizon. I was shaking the entire drive back, and I soaked the seat and steering wheel in sweat. I made it home. I nearly had a heart attack before opening my bedroom, not sure what to expect. When my wife woke up, I told her I fell asleep in the bar parking lot. She was disappointed, but I could live with that. I couldn't tell her what I saw. I couldn't tell her that I was almost pulled into the other side of the bridge. She wouldn't understand. I've been shaking all morning. I can't sleep. I called into work just to write this because I need to tell someone what happened. I promise you I'm never going back near that fucking road. I can still feel its presence. It still pulls me to it. I still have to know what's at the end, but I'm fighting against it. I'm terrified of what happens if I make that cross. I know when I go to sleep I'll find myself there again, but I have to fight it. I've cursed myself with an endless battle. So now I'm trying to remind myself that there's nothing down that road. It doesn't go anywhere. There is nothing at the end. Every town has a legend. In the case of Reverie Road, I'd rather keep it just that. A legend. The apartment complex was at the end of a badly maintained road with nothing but miles of dead land and sand stretching out behind it. I found the apartment on some obscure website with no ratings. It wasn't what I usually go for, but the trip was so last minute, and all the hotels in the area had no vacancies whatsoever for the night, so I had no other choice. You see, my father had a heart attack last night and was currently still in the hospital. I flew 2 hours, rode a bus for twice that, and would have stayed the night at my father's place while he recovered if it weren't for his awful girlfriend, who hates me for reasons still unclear to me. So there I was, staying in a cramped 7th floor apartment with a single bedroom as wide as I am tall, which is about 5'6". So that was fun. My father was fine. He woke up in the hospital and seemed no worse for the wear, but they kept him at the hospital for an additional 24 hours to run tests and whatnot. After I visited him, I stopped by the bar restaurant across the street from the apartment complex and bought a painfully oily pizza, which I ate on the creaky couch in the living room as I tried to get a hold of literally any channel on the shitty TV, which looked like it hadn't been dusted since Bush was president. I washed the glass I drank juice from and hummed along to Killing Me Softly, which was playing on the only functional piece of technology I came across in the apartment, an ancient radio. The apartment wouldn't have been that bad if it had a good view. However, the only window in the apartment was in the bedroom, and it looked onto the inside of the building. The only things I could see were the rickety elevator, the stairs, and the other interior-facing windows in the complex. My flight back was 2 days later. I had booked the cheapest possible round trip, so I had plenty of time to kill. I did so by sitting in bed and working on my final statistics paper, which was due in a week. I wasn't too worried though, as my professor was always quite lenient with deadlines. And soon the concentrated reading drifted to empty staring at the cage elevator outside the window. I'd been staring at the elevator for almost an hour when I realized that in that entire time, it hadn't moved from my floor. I found this strange, since the site I'd booked the apartment on declared it was the last available vacancy for the next few nights, and so I assumed the complex would be full of people. And yet, it was so very still outside, unnaturally so. No noise, no movement. I shrugged it off and tried to focus on my work once more, but my attention returned to the small window and the view beyond. Anyone else would have dismissed it as a coincidence or something, but I just couldn't shake off the feeling that something was most definitely wrong. I got up and went to the bathroom. I splashed some water on my face, blamed the uneasiness on the exhaustion induced by my trip here, and toweled my dry skin. I returned to the bedroom and got back in bed. I was about to reach over to turn off the lamp on the floor next to the bed. No bedside table, of course. When I noticed the figure standing in front of the elevator. My unease was momentarily quelled. Hallelujah, another human being. But it soon returned when I realized that whoever it was not moving. Not as in waiting, standing still, as in completely motionless. No normal fidgeting or adjusting or consulting a phone while waiting for the elevator. The elevator. The elevator. The elevator was right here. It was still on my floor, right there in front of the figure. Why wasn't whoever it was getting on it? I watched with growing anticipation as the figure remained unnervingly still. I considered waving or doing something to alert whoever it was that the elevator was right there, in case they hadn't realized, but I thought better of it and remained unmoving on the bed, just watching. I don't know how long I sat there watching the figure, but it must have been at least a few hours. In all that time, the figure didn't move, not even once. I didn't look away from it a single time either. It was then that my phone dinged, and in my concentrated haze, it took a moment for that sound to register. I blinked and reached for it, tearing my gaze away from the figure and gluing it to the screen. It was a text from my father. Thanks for coming by today. Means a lot. Come over for lunch tomorrow. I smiled at that. I started typing out a response when I recalled the figure and jerked my head up to check on it. An involuntary shiver ran down my spine. It was gone. The figure was gone. I scrambled off the bed and tiptoed over to the window. I looked out and stifled a scream as I realized the figure was now standing in front of the door to my apartment. Still eerily unmoving. Still just as ambiguous. It looked vaguely human, but who could have stayed frozen that perfectly for such a prolonged period of time? I was not a believer in the occult, but the festering feeling of fear in my gut whispered innumerable possibilities of what the figure was, of what could happen. I could feel the fear unravel, and its tendrils begin to caress my skin and wrap around my limbs, but I pressed my lips together and backed slowly away from the window. I sat back in bed and tucked my knees to my chest. My eyes stuck to the window despite the fact that I could not see the figure nor the front door from the angle at which I was sitting. It was okay. I was okay. I had my phone with good reception, and I could call the police immediately whenever I needed to. I had locked and deadbolted the door, so... This time the tremor that went through my body did not stop at my spine. The door. I hadn't locked it. I had come in with too many things in my arms to be able to lock the door. I had told myself to put the stuff down on the table as soon as I came in, and to go back and deadbolt the door, but now I was second-guessing whether I had actually done so or not. I stood up on shaky legs and gripped my phone in my left hand. I began the seemingly endless trek down the hallway, painfully aware of the silence outside. My heart was thundering in my ears, making it difficult to hear anything else. It was amidst the loud racket of my erratic heartbeat that I was suddenly acutely aware of another sound. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Something was scratching at the front door. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was becoming more insistent, accompanied by a gentle thumping sound. Scratch, scratch, thump. My heart kicked up its pace and adrenaline coursed through me. I ran into the living room and slammed my body against the door, and slipped the deadbolt across as I fumbled with the lock with the hand that held my phone. My sudden burst of movement and noise seemed to infuriate whatever it was on the other side of the door, as there was an indignant whine accompanied by a series of thumps. I backed away from the secured door, and hurried back to the bedroom where I shut the door and sat in the bed with my arms wrapped around my shins. I looked at my phone, clutched in my trembling hand, and I unlocked it and brought up the keypad in the phone app. My fingers barely stopped shaking enough to type in the 3 digits and hit call. I brought the phone to my ear and listened intently. More thumps and scratches sounded from the direction of the front door and the window, and I tried desperately to tune them out. The call drops. I hold the phone out and try again. 911. Call. It drops again. Why? I have 3 bars. That's plenty to call with. I call again and again and again. Each time I get nothing. A loud bang reverberates through the apartment and I flinch. I try calling my dad, but the same thing happens. I send a text message that simply reads, "Dad." I almost sob when it goes through. He responds a few moments later. "What?" I text back, my stiff fingers flying across the screen. "Need help. Someone at the door." I felt terrible worrying him while he was in hospital, but I had no other choice. He typed for a while. "Where are you? Why didn't you stay at my place?" I texted back, "Not important." I tensed as another loud bang sounded, a whimper following shortly afterwards. "Not important. Please call police." With that, I sent him my current location. I sat back in bed and tried to control my breathing. What the fuck was that outside? Why me? Why now? Thoughts flitted across my mind, almost too fast for me to grab and decipher. Right then I heard a different sound. At first I couldn't tell what it was. I listened intently through the bangs and scratches, and when I finally understood the sound, I recoiled and felt a knot form in my chest. Whatever it was knew my name, and now it was repeating it over and over in a horrid, guttural voice that caused goosebumps to erupt all over my body. It has been 18 hours. I haven't moved from my bed unless I absolutely had to go to the bathroom. I am surrounded by the noise and I don't know what to do. My father kept texting me throughout, but I stopped checking my messages about 16 hours ago, when he sent a single text that made my heart sink low into my chest. "Are you sure you sent the right location? Police say there's nothing but a dead-end road with miles of desert beyond." All the while, the thing keeps repeating my name, increasingly, relentlessly, as though begging me to open the door. This feeling of desperation is driving me mad. At this point, maybe I'll let it in after all. I didn't know where else I could post this where I wouldn't immediately be ridiculed. I work for a private armed security company. We handle mostly Chicago area housing projects. Shootings, stabbings, domestics, drugs. We see a lot in this job, and you learn pretty quickly not to get easily rattled. You also get used to being called Paul Blart or Rent-A-Cop. We used to handle housing projects exclusively, but the company has been expanding and we've been getting new types of contracts. Dispensaries, schools, and as of last week, a huge 12-story retirement home built in the 1970s in a low-income area. I was out of town for most of last week, so my partner and I, Joe, hadn't been to the new retirement home property yet. Our supervisors had been there a couple times, just to quote the contract and do a couple daytime runs to identify areas of interest for us to be on the lookout for. Secluded areas of the parking lot, exterior doors, and don't close all the way, etc. Joe and I work overnights. And last night we took the first night shift of the new property. There's not a lot of detailed information about the property handed down to us from the day shift. We knew only that it wasn't a full-time contract. We were to stop over there for a couple hours from our main nearby housing project property when we got a chance. The note left to us from our day shift supervisor read simply, Magnolia Terrace. Make sure exterior doors are locked. Check cars in parking lot. We caught a dude getting blown by a hooker around noon yesterday, and building management says people do drugs out there. Make sure the interior doors to the game room and social room are locked. No one should be in there after 8 p.m. Make sure there are no old people dead in the hallways. Maintenance guy checks the cameras in the morning, so he'll know if you don't go. Make sure you find time to get over there. After midnight, approximately 2 a.m. is fine. Check every floor. Roof is off limits. Don't be stupid. A single key was taped to the note. Last night was a relatively straightforward night in the projects. We had a pretty big group fight, but following the breakup by us and the police department, we figured we had a good window of opportunity where things would settle down a bit for a few hours. Joe and I hopped in my car and headed over to the retirement home property. As we pulled up, the building loomed over us like we were looking up from the bottom of a cliff. It's much larger than the type of buildings we usually patrol. After pausing for a moment in the car while we took in the size of the place, Joe uttered, "This place better have a fucking elevator." It was designed more like an old hotel than a retirement home. We pulled around the semicircle drive up and parked right in front of the main doors. I groaned as I got out of the car, still sore from getting punched in the ribs during the earlier altercation, not helped by the cold that evening. We opened the first set of doors, walked through a small vestibule, and the single key we were given granted us access through the second set of doors to the main lobby. While the layout was similar to a hotel, there was none of the grandeur you might expect from one. While the lobby was large with plenty of seating, furniture, and art, it was run down and clearly representative of the low-income area in which the building stood. Where you might expect to be greeted by a clerk from behind the main desk, it was clearly deserted and lit with reduced, somewhat dim lighting for the evening. The only life in the lobby was a large, rectangular wooden bird cage the size of a refrigerator, full of finches, all sleeping and puffed up on their perches. I noted a single security camera covering the lobby, and figuring this was the camera the maintenance guy would review in the morning to ensure we'd made our rounds, I waved at the camera like a smartass. "Let's get started. McDonald's closes soon and I want a milkshake." Joe nodded to me. Joe is an Army veteran, and a man of few words. A Marine Corps vet myself, I usually have even fewer to offer when I'm working. "All right," I grunted in return, still cranky about my sore ribs. We've worked together long enough that we don't need to verbally coordinate too much. The lobby split off into 2 hallways, one left and one right, and we automatically went our separate ways, pulling each door handle we passed to ensure they were locked. As I made my way down the half of the route, I noted the signs outside of some of the doors. Game room. I made extra sure that one was locked, and it was. A few doors down, social room. I grabbed the handle expecting it to be locked like the previous 20 doors, but to my surprise, the handle turned. Curious, I peeked inside. The social room had about 12 circular tables strewn about the room, each mated with 4 chairs. There were some small bookshelves with worn volumes, a folded, unread newspaper on an end table next to an old sofa facing a record player at the opposite end of the room. Everything was neat and tidy. I painted the room with my flashlight, checking for occupants, and noted it to be empty. Between the old shag-style carpeting and the cork ceiling panels, the room was dead quiet and padded from any traveling sound. It reminded me of the time I'd been in a recording booth for a project in high school. I could hear my own ears ringing in the silence. From a great distance down the hall, I could hear the faint sound of Joe's familiar voice. "Let's go, motherfucker. Milkshake." Since Joe had our only key. I locked the door from the inside, swung it shut with authority, and again checked the handle. Firmly locked. I made my way back to the lobby to rendezvous with Joe, who was pointing to 2 elevators while wearing his trademark shit-eating grin, adding, "See, dreams do come true." I made my way to his side. "Good, not in a stairs mood," I replied. "You do the honors." "With pleasure," he said, pressing the button to call whichever of the 2 elevators would reach us first. It was clear the elevators were slow, as we were waiting for what felt like a couple minutes for the ones to arrive. "I'm never going to get this shake," Joe lamented. But no sooner did he finish his sentence than we were met with the ding of the elevator, which sounded like it utilized an actual physical bell to announce its arrival. We pressed 2 to make our way to the second of the 12 total floors we'd need to check before leaving. The elevator groaned like I did getting out of the car, and slowly lifted us to our first stop. "We'd probably be done by now if we'd taken the stairs," Joe jokingly remarked. The hallways flanked the elevator, straight left and right, and in our haste to get to McDonald's sooner, we agreed to cut a small corner and take turns getting off the elevator for a quick glance down the length of the halls to see if anything was blatantly amiss, rather than disembarking the elevator entirely to check each resident's floor. "They're adults," we justified, and should be able to close their own doors. By the time the elevator triumphantly lurched to the 5th floor, I grew bored with the hop off, look left and right, get back on routine, and like any good security guard, I decided to fuck with Joe. When the doors groaned open at the 5th floor following the familiar belting of the elevator's arrival, I slowly stepped off. As the doors began to close behind me, I carefully timed an "oh my god" and took off down the hallway as if in pursuit of something. "What is it?" I heard Joe exclaim, the end of his sentence cut off by the elevator doors closing all the way. I knew we'd hit all the elevator buttons when we got on the 1st floor, so I had a good belly laugh to myself, knowing he was trapped slowly en route to the next floor. My laugh was cut short by my still sore ribs. I hit the call button for the opposite elevator, got on, and hit floor 12, in a plan to eventually meet him at the top floor, leaving him to check the remainder of the floors himself because I'm kind of a dick like that. I knew he'd have done the same had he come up with the prank first. "Where did you go? What's happening?" Joe's voice crackled over the radio. I purposely didn't respond, because no good joke is complete without a few minutes of making him think I'm dead. I arrived at the top floor, disembarked my elevator, and waited patiently so. When Joe arrived, I could laugh at him and get a reluctant laugh out of him in return when he realized he'd been had. But that never happened. After a several minutes standing in silence at the top floor, I could hear the faint bell dings of Joe's elevator arriving at the doors below mine, getting louder as it approached. As I prepared my line of "got you good, chicken fucker," for Joe's arrival, adapted from one of our favorite movies, the doors of Joe's elevator opened at my floor. I managed to blurt "got you good" before realizing the doors were opening to an empty elevator. Joe wasn't in it. Ah, the old double-cross counter prank. I thought to myself, this wasn't Joe's first rodeo. Realizing we were now in a prank standoff that could potentially last hours, given our history, I keyed up the radio. Alright, man, you got me. Yeah, let's wrap it up and get to McDonald's. No reply. He was committed. Seriously, dude, it's going to close soon. My statement cut off by a door slamming shut. Hard. About 25 feet to my right. The sign over the door was labeled Stairs. The sly bastard was trying to come up around me. I bolted over to the stairwell and shouted down the space between the railings that allowed me to see all the way down to the bottom floor. I already got you. If you want your shake, we gotta wrap it up now. And then I saw it. While peering down the space between the railings, I made out a face. If I can even call it a face. Staring back up at me about 5 floors down. It was what could possibly be an old man, or maybe a woman with white eyes and a surreal, toothy grin from ear to ear on a mouth too big to possibly fit in its head. It didn't move at all but to blink, and its mouth slowly opening to reveal its teeth to be sharp like that of a predator. It then disappeared, retracting itself into the stairway with unnatural abruptness. For a moment I was frozen in place, before coming to with a justifiable, what the fucking shit, and withdrawing myself back into the hallway so fast that I stumbled, slamming the door shut behind me. As I took a moment to process what I'd seen, I could hear footsteps in the stairwell from behind the door, with a quick cadence, getting louder as they made their way up. My heart pounding so hard I could hear the blood surging through my ears in the otherwise silence of the 12th floor hallway. I pressed the elevator call button frantically. My elevator was still idling at the 12th floor, and as the doors slowly opened, I squeezed through and repeatedly slammed the door close button like my life depended on it. Before the elevator doors shut, I could hear the stairwell door swing open, and the sound of someone running down the hallway towards my elevator. I managed to squeak out a, "Not funny, dude," right as the doors shut, moments before whoever or whatever it was reached the elevator. I again froze for a moment before something began pounding on the opposite side of the elevator doors with ungodly strength. The sound was overwhelming. I subconsciously reached for the handle of my gun in its holster, squeezing it so hard my knuckles turned white. I came to my senses, realizing I'd yet to key in a floor selection on the elevator button panel, and I then must have hit the floor 1 button 50 times in an effort to put distance between myself and the top floor. The elevator was probably down to the 9th floor before I stopped pressing the floor 1 button. As the elevator slowly made its way down, I had a moment to collect myself. I couldn't reconcile what the hell I'd just seen. It had to be Joe, but I couldn't believe what I'd seen was a mask. And I'd never seen him move as fast as that thing did. Even when we'd been shot at in the past, he'd never moved faster than a brisk jog. One of his trademark lines was, "My running days ended the day I got out of the army." And I couldn't imagine he'd have the foresight to put this much effort into a prank beforehand. I frantically tried to calm my voice and reach him over the radio, still getting no response but static. I decided that, well, I liked Joe. I could always make new friends, and that when my elevator reached the bottom floor, I was getting the fuck out of that building, whether or not I'd found Joe. Then the elevator stopped. I looked up at the floor indicator and realized I wasn't at the first floor. I was at floor 5. I looked at the button panel, and the only floor selected was the first floor. The elevator shouldn't have stopped. Ding. The elevator bell mocked. The doors squeaked open, and there I saw it. Joe standing there, smiling, hands on his hips. That was pretty low effort, even for you, dude. As he stepped onto the elevator, chuckling. Wait, why are you going back to the first floor? We have to check the others, he questioned. Did you not hear me calling you over the radio? I've been trying to get to you for like 20 minutes. I asked, trying not to sound shook, just in case this was the prestige conclusion of whatever mastermind prank he'd executed. No. What? I went up to 6, got on the other elevator and came down, and then yours arrived. It's been like 2 minutes, dude. I just stared ahead, trying to process what he said. He must have thought I was still in character, because after a moment he said, "Just give it up, man. We need to finish the rest of the building," rolling his eyes. Our elevator reached the bottom floor. Ding, and the doors open. Joe went to reach for the elevator button panel to send us back up, and I grabbed his wrist. "No," I blurted, and he looked at me startled and confused. I cleared my throat. "No." Trying to calm myself. "Fuck it. Let's just go get McDonald's. The only camera is in the lobby. They won't know we didn't go all the way to the top." "Alright, but it's your write-up if we get our asses chewed. I'm past due for my milkshake anyway," he said, stepping off the elevator into the lobby in agreement with the pep in his step he only got at the prospect of a milkshake. As we made our way through the lobby space towards the front doors, I noticed all the birds in the cage that had been asleep were flying around frantically, chirping and bashing into the cage walls and one another, as if a cat had gotten in. "Fuck, it's cold," Joe noted, as we shut the car doors behind us. "You good?" I sat staring out the windshield of the driver's seat for a moment before responding. "Yeah, just spacing out. Did you see?" And I cut myself off before finishing my thought. I didn't want to sound crazy. I had to be crazy, right? "Never mind. Let's get the fuck out of here. I'm hungry." Joe looked at me puzzled, but used to me being a weirdo, he let it pass without protest as we drove off. I tried to put it out of my head. The rest of the night back in the projects was busy enough that I was able to almost forget what had happened at the retirement home. I went home and went to sleep, almost without giving it a second thought, until this afternoon. I woke up to my dog staring at me from the side of the bed, asking me for a walk. I sat up, but was quickly reminded my ribs were bruised. As I nursed myself to my feet, I grabbed my phone to check it, and opened a text message from my supervisor. "Why the hell didn't you guys ever make it over to the retirement home last night? The maintenance guy checked the cameras and he's pissed. Call me." Gazing into space was a natural interest of mine as a kid. My first real big present was a telescope. I was out there on my lawn for every astronomical event. My dad was always right there with me. We saw the Perseids, supermoons, planets. I got better and better telescopes. My dad and I would even go on camping trips just to see some faraway meteor showers. Things were great until I was about 12 years old. My dad vanished. Not a word to my mom, not a word to me. No one saw him on the day he disappeared. We filed a missing person report, but even now, 10 years later, absolutely nothing has come of it. I still remember the last message he sent me, the night before he disappeared. He took a high-res picture of the Big Dipper. But there was one star that wasn't supposed to be there. He asked me if I could identify it. I couldn't manage to figure out what that star was. Never seen it on another picture of the Big Dipper. After he disappeared, I pretty much quit stargazing. It felt so empty without him. It wasn't worth my time. However, this Halloween weekend of 2021, I heard about this huge Aurora Borealis event in North America. All the telescopes I owned as a kid were sold, but That was an impressive phenomena you could see with your naked eye. I had plans for a Halloween party on Sunday. However, I figured on Saturday I could drive out to some dark place and catch a glimpse of it. I asked my friend Michelle if she wanted to come, but she was busy all weekend. Typical. At about 10 p.m., I drove out to a hiking trail with no light pollution. As I drove in, there was literally no one there. Of course, that was understandable. It was -5 degrees. I had on a winter coat, a beanie, and a pair of mittens. I could already see the aurora borealis, but I figured I could hike up for a better view. It was dark out and kinda unnerving to be hiking alone in the wilderness, but I had bear spray. Still, that didn't stop me from almost jumping out of my skin hearing a branch crack behind me. It must have been nothing, or at least nothing I could see. When I almost tripped on a root hiking up, I decided to turn on my phone's flashlight, but even though I had it fully charged when I left, it was at 5%. I cursed to myself. Shoddy phone batteries, am I right? I figured I'd better save the battery I had in case I needed to make a call. Aside from that, the climb was actually pretty relaxing. It took me about 30 minutes before I reached a clearing in the trail. The view was to die for. The colors were vivid, and the lights danced so nicely. I spent a long time looking at it, just sorta losing myself in the spectacle. I figured I'd take a picture to show my friends, but my phone was dead. I let out a heavy sigh, my breath forming a cloud in the cold. It was the sensible thing to head back to my car now, so I figured I'd just take one last look at the aurora borealis, then head back. There was something there I hadn't seen the first times I looked, though. A super bright star. It shined brightly, even against the lights. I don't know why, but I had this pit in my stomach looking at it. At first, I assumed it was the International Space Station, but it was moving so oddly that it couldn't be. It was also getting brighter and brighter. Maybe I was just in shock, but it took me what felt like forever to clue into the fact that it was getting closer. This deep, buzzing sound filled the air as a violet light beamed down onto where I was standing. It was so loud I thought I might go deaf, and so bright I thought I might go blind. I could barely see, but there was a massive black and violet triangle hovering above me. It was so surreal, it was almost like a dream. Then suddenly, all at once, the sound stopped. The brightest lights shut off. There was nothing left but the ship and the low humming it emitted. The bottom of the ship folded open in 3 directions towards its corners, and something began to descend weightlessly through the air down towards me. Tall, gray, thin men, with large black soulless eyes. Lucky for me, my fight or flight reflex finally kicked in, and I chose flight. I bolted out of there the fastest I've ever run in my life. I could hear those aliens behind me, chittering and making ethereal, hissing noises. I could tell they were coming after me by the noises they made getting louder, but I couldn't hear them running. They moved in complete silence save for their otherworldly vocalizations. I was running for my life down that hiking trail, screaming for help. Just my luck, though, I tripped on a root, sticking out of the trail, and fell flat on my face. I moved quickly to get back up, but even though I heard nothing, they were already upon me. One of them was standing over me, doing nothing but staring. It began to reach out for me with its long, gray fingers. I thought fast and sprayed that thing in the face with my bear spray. I wasn't sure it would work, but the bear spray made it stumble back and scream. That alien had such a loud, shrill scream that my ears began ringing in my head. Even though it hurt, the adrenaline kept me going, and I continued my sprint down the mountain. I managed to reach the parking lot and quickly unlocked my car, then jumped in. I started it, and the headlights illuminated 4 of the aliens standing at the start of the trail. They were so tall, gray but in a way I've never seen before. Their inscrutable eyes stared into me as I backed out of the parking lot and sped into the safety of the highway. On the drive home, I realized my ears were bleeding, and I could barely hear anything. I decided to drive to the hospital to get it checked out. I made some shit up about listening to my music too loud. They clearly didn't buy it. It was late, however, so they didn't bother questioning it. They stuffed some cotton in my ears and told me to wait for a doctor to examine me. About 20 minutes later, the doctor showed up and took a look into my ears. There was a grim expression on his face as he finished the exam, and he told me I'll have permanent hearing damage. My tears started to well up. The doctor said he'd give me some time and left. I started crying. I could barely hear my own sobs, but I spent about 5 minutes there. It wasn't just losing my hearing that made me cry. It was the stress of the whole experience. I couldn't get their eyes out of my head. I eventually managed to collect myself and got up. The doctor told me that I'll need hearing aids. He referred me to a hearing specialist and sent me on my way. I laid in my bed that night, unable to sleep with all the thoughts in my head. I was looking through old photos on my phone, and I saw that picture my dad texted me of the Big Dipper. Maybe it's my imagination, but I could have sworn that the out-of-place star glowed with a violet hue. When I was younger, around 12 or 13, my family and I lived in an old rundown town in the mountains. It used to be a big mining town until a massive cave-in happened a few decades ago. All the companies went bust trying to get out of the rubble, and most people left. Now the town's falling apart. Its abandoned outskirts filled with squatters. We were the first people to actually move there in years. It wasn't ideal, to say the least, but my family was strapped for cash and didn't have much of a choice. We had a nice enough place near the main street. The walls were a bit cracked and the pipes would leak sometimes, but that was about as good as it got here. Despite this, I had a pretty good life in that quiet little town. One day, though, someone moved into the old dilapidated house across from mine. I remember waking up to a commotion outside one chilly October morning. A crowd had gathered in the streets, all looking in awe at the house. Overnight, it had gone from a collapsed pile of timbers and shingles to a pristine little bungalow with a perfectly trimmed lawn and colorful flower beds. I watched from my window as an old woman stepped out of the house and hung a sign from the roof of the porch. She was short with a kind, wrinkled face, and long graying hair pushed into a single braid. I almost laughed. She looked like the quintessential grandma. As for the sign, it was a simple piece of wood spray painted white with "Dogs for Sale, $1.07. Painted in bold red letters. She turned around, finally noticing the crowd in front of her house. The crowd sat motionless, waiting for some kind of explanation. All the woman did was smile and wave before pointing to the sign and walking back into the house. A blanket of silence descended on the street. I sat there glued to my window, waiting for someone to make a move. Finally, my next-door neighbor, Mr. Gonzalez, strode right up to the door and knocked. The old woman answered almost immediately, and the two talked for a few minutes before Mr. Gonzalez pulled something out of his pocket and handed it to her. The woman smiled and went back inside for a few minutes, emerging with a tiny dachshund puppy. Mr. Gonzalez took the puppy and returned to the crowd while the old woman disappeared inside. I couldn't believe it. The sign wasn't just some bizarre joke. Over the next few days, I'd learn more about the old woman and her business. Apparently all you had to do was hand her the money, and she'd bring out whatever dog you asked for, no matter how specific. One of my friends even requested an exact copy of his old mutt, and she'd brought the dog out without even asking what his old mutt looked like. We started calling her the dog witch after that. It's not like anyone knew her real name, though. The old woman was a total recluse. Nobody had ever seen her leave her house, much less talk to anybody. People like her were nothing new in our town, but there was something different about the dog witch. Me and my friends took to spying on her, acting like we were investigating some great mystery. We even got one of those cork boards to pin up our observations, just like those detectives on TV. The little we managed to find only deepened our fascination. From what we could see peeking through the windows, the house was clean, tidy, and overall cozy. A far cry from the rest of the houses on the street, but nothing ever moved inside of it. Nor did we ever see any dogs in there. It was like we were looking into a painting. In fact, no matter how hard we pressed our ears to the cold walls of the house, we never heard a peep from inside. All we found out from our stakeouts was that she always brought the dogs up from a basement behind a dark red door. After days of investigation yielding nothing, we all gave up and moved on to terrorizing the little kids on our street. But the dog witch never left the back of my mind. Whenever I tried to relax, my mind kept slipping back to just what might be behind that red door. It must have stuck with my friends too, seeing as they kept inserting her into the ghost stories we'd tell to the 6th graders at lunch. Halloween was right around the corner though, so I managed to keep my mind off the old woman for a while. I still had to figure out what I'd dress up as after all. After a long night of stealing candy bowls, smashing pumpkins, and being chased by irate parents, me and my friends were making our way down my street. As we passed the dog witch's house, my friend Derek stepped and dared me to go up and knock on the door. Wanting to look cool in front of my friends, I just laughed and walked right up into her porch. I knocked on the door and waited, but the dog witch never answered. I knocked a few more times, but still nothing. This might not seem all that strange for Halloween, but we'd never seen the old lady ignore the door before. My friends had joined me by now, peeking through the windows and knocking on the door themselves. Finally, I decided to try the doorknob. To my surprise, the door was unlocked and swung inwards like it was floating on a cushion of air. Felt like the house was pulling me inside, towards the basement. My friends hung back in the doorway as I slowly made my way inside. They kept calling me back, telling me this was a bad idea, but I didn't listen. Oh, come on, guys. The dog witch is either out or asleep. I urged them. Let's just go check out the basement really quick. Derek gave in and walked into the house, but the others wouldn't budge. Let's just get this over with, man. Derek said as we slowly crept through the tidy hallways, making our way through the living room and into the seemingly unused kitchen at the back of the house. There, right next to the pantry, was the dark red door to the basement. The door was warm to the touch, and a thin, wavering strip of light spilled out from underneath it. Derek grabbed a knife out of a kitchen drawer as I slowly pulled the door open. Behind it, a rotted wood staircase led down into the basement. It opened up on the right, with candlelight flickering around the corner and beckoning us down. After a brief whispered argument, Derek took the lead as we started down the staircase. It took us nearly 5 minutes to make it down to where the stairs opened up, mainly because the old wood threatened to collapse under the slightest pressure. The basement, at least what we could see of it, was a lot different than the rest of the house. It was grimy and empty, with a dirt floor and cracked concrete walls. A set of iron shackles was drilled into the wall facing the staircase. A sound like raw meat being slapped against a table reverberated from around the corner. Derek was leaning forward to try and see where it was coming from when the wood railing snapped and he tumbled onto the basement floor. The sound stopped. Derek pulled himself up and screamed. Bracing onto the wall, I looked around the corner and saw it. I can't exactly describe what lay at the other end of the basement. It defies words, a description, comprehension even. Picture an entire meat-packing plant stuffed into the corner of a room, with chunks of flesh and waste seeping through the gaps between its pipes and folds. Fibrous black roots of something between steel and chitin snaked throughout the machine and anchored it to the floor. The mass of industrial equipment groaned and struggled against them like a caged animal. The mutilated bodies of local squatters were piled up next to a hatch leading into the machine. On the opposite side were several tapered pipes that ran along the ceiling before dropping down over a steel table. Glistening strings of meat extruded from these pipes, wrapping themselves in neat spindles on the table. The old woman stood in front of the table, her body deformed against recognition. Her once kind face drooped and sagged like a poorly fit mask, and her bone-thin arms now hung down to her ankles. 6 long, dexterous fingers extended from her hands, each slimming to a needle-like point. Panting on the table behind her was a half-woven pit bull, its back half trailing off into those strings of flesh. The old woman turned to face Derek as he scrambled backwards to the staircase. His ankle was bent almost completely backwards. The witch's mouth gaped open an impossible amount, and she let out a screech-like white noise. She started lumbering towards us, moving almost mechanically. The noise was becoming almost deafening. Derek was trying his hardest to crawl up the stairs, but that thing was almost on top of him. As much as I'd like to say I tried my hardest to save him, the truth is I scrambled back up those stairs and never looked back. I could hear him screaming as I busted through the front door. Chaos filled the streets outside. Mangled hounds ran through the neighborhood, their once pristine hides sloughing off to reveal rotting strands spun like muscle. They crashed through windows, slammed into doors, chased people down and tore into them. I sprinted across the street towards my house, slamming my knee into a hound as it leapt at me. It doubled over and growled as it tried to get back up. I didn't stop to finish it off, instead bursting through my front door and barricading it as best as I could. The hound banged against the door before crashing through a nearby window. My dad appeared at the top of the stairs, shotgun in hand, yelling for me to get my ass up there. I practically leapt up those steps, the hound right behind me. I could feel its red-hot breath on my heels. I threw myself behind my dad as he blasted the thing. Its body tumbled down the steps and lay twitching in the foyer. As my dad was dragging me up, I saw the dog's threads unravel. White TV static poured out from within its corpse. After that, me and my family bunkered down in my parents' bedroom. All night the hounds pounded against the bedroom door, but it somehow managed to hold out. I must have passed out at some point, and when I came to, it was already morning. To my confusion, I was somehow in my bedroom. I could hear my mom cooking breakfast downstairs. Looking outside, there was no evidence left of last night's carnage. The dog witch's house was gone, too, replaced by a pile of junk and rubble. When I asked my parents about last night, they didn't seem to remember any of it. I told them about what happened, about the old lady and the machine and the hounds, but they just looked at me like I was crazy. My friends gave me the same reaction too, telling me there never was a Derek or a dog witch. I even tried Derek's parents, but they just disappeared too. Their neighbors saying no one had lived in their house for years. Eventually I gave up, chalked the whole thing up as a nightmare, and tried to move on. We moved out of that town a few years later. I went to college, got my own place, and was living pretty good. In fact, I'd nearly forgotten about that night until yesterday. I was talking with one of my neighbors when they told me something strange. Apparently someone new had just moved on to our street. Hanging from the front porch of their pristine new house was a simple white sign reading, "Dogs for sale, $1.07. Devil's Night. The night before Halloween. All Hallows Eve. Some call it Mischief Night, but those who do miss the point entirely. They even try to change the name to Angels Night in Detroit. They hosted entire teams of volunteers to try to prevent the hundreds of building and home fires that would be set. The volunteers would patrol neighborhoods beginning at dusk, with the goal of creating a presence that would stop the monsters from lighting the fires to begin with. And if they lit one anyway, the Angels Night volunteers would have immediate contact with authorities to send the closest fire department to extinguish the problem. Sure, it worked for a while, but that only allowed the public consciousness to regain focus on the true meaning of Devil's Night. It's not about fires. The fires are simply a distraction, a redirection. Some say it's the one night every year that you can do literally anything you want, and it would be accepted by your community as part of the price of living. You give for 364 days, and you take for one. In my town, it's not uncommon to see armed residents on the rooftops of their homes and businesses, brandishing shotguns from the time it gets dark until the rooster crows in the morning, signaling that it is once again safe to go about your daily routines. But that never stopped us. We knew where to go and where not to go. My usual group and I went out after 11 p.m. to begin the night's festivities. Brent was 16 and just got his license, so he was driving us that night. In the trunk, we had bags full of toilet paper, eggs, paintball guns, and a few other goodies. We all met up at Brent's place, where we pushed his dad's Delta 88 down the street until we were at a safe distance, at which point, Brent jumped in the driver's seat and started it up. We all piled in and headed off. You really think it's safe to take your dad's car without asking? I asked Brent. I do whatever I want. He doesn't have to know. Brent replied. We had a list of appointments we had to keep throughout the night. First up was Mr. Johnson, from Johnson's Corner Store. This guy was always a jerk to us. Whenever we'd enter the store, he'd start bitching. It took more than 15 seconds between entering and taking what I want to the register to pay. He'd start up again. You sure you have money? What are you trying to find? Are you stealing from me? If any one of us looked at a magazine, he'd yell, You gonna read it or you gonna buy it? Put it down or pay for it. We parked down the block from his house to avoid detection, and took just what we needed on foot. We covered his tree in toilet paper, then each launched an egg at his windows as we took off running. Just when we had reached the car, we heard Johnson come out of his front door and scream something at us. I don't remember what it was, but I'm sure it was something like, You gonna pay for those eggs? We did. We did pay for those eggs. and we brought them from someone else's store, just to add insult to injury. We were gone before he had any chance of figuring out who it was, and it was too dark to see faces that far away anyway. After that, we completed hits on 3 more run-of-the-mill jerks, all well deserving of it. There was Betty, the town busybody, who was always trying to get everybody in trouble for everything. She once claimed to my parents that my friends and I had thrown rocks at her windows. It wasn't true. I had never been near her house, let alone thrown anything at it. I didn't even know where she lived at the time. I got grounded for a month over it, because my dad believed her without evidence and didn't believe me. Since I had to pay for a crime that I didn't commit, I figured it's only fair that we actually commit that crime now, to make it even. Next up was Mr. Shaylin, who was always trying to get teen girls to come hang out with him at his house. He would regularly try to become friends with them by giving them music or movies that he knew they liked. He even tried it with Joey's sister. Joey took the honors of the first egg at this guy's house. We also did a nice drive-by egging of Travis Becker's house. Travis was a 17-year-old who bullied all of us and anybody else who was smaller than him at school. You know the type. Football player, shiny teeth, thinks he's God's gift to women. We didn't want Travis' parents to be mistaken about why their house was targeted, so we made sure to yell some obscenities with the name Travis attached to the end as we were making our getaway. Pretty great night so far. Here's where things start to get hairy. Next on our hit list was Mr. Farley, a history teacher from our high school. He's the teacher who was always into everybody's business. If you were having a friendly tiff with someone in the hallway, he'd be the one to threaten detention for everyone involved, regardless of who did what. He was also that teacher who would stop and question you if you were in the hallway during class, whether you had a pass in your hand or not. In fact, once when I was using the bathroom during a class, I could swear that he came into the bathroom to harass and scare me. I was in a stall when I heard the door open, and I heard his familiar stomp walk coming in. I heard him using a urinal, but instead of hearing him walk out the door afterward, I heard nothing. I didn't even hear him wash his hands, like he was just standing there, waiting for me to come out of the stall so he could demand to see my pass or otherwise question what I was doing there. I even think I heard him sniffing and getting closer to the stall door. After that sound stopped, I hurriedly got myself together, opened the door, and expected to run past him, but he wasn't there. Somehow he left without me hearing it. Farley lived down a dirt road in the area of town where you'd expect to see a lot of fields, maybe even a few farmers. We parked down the road. It was pretty scary, to be honest, because there were no streetlights out here in this country-fied area of town. We were basically walking through complete darkness in the middle of the night, where anything could happen, and nobody would see it. The only lights were dim porch lights on some of the sparsely placed houses in the distance. After we walked for maybe 10 seconds, I turned to look back at the car, but it was so dark that I couldn't see it anymore. We had a special package for Farley. This wasn't a completely original plan, but we thought it would be funny to see him fall for it. Earlier in the night, while Steve cleaned up the gifts that his dog left in the backyard, he prepared a brown paper sack full of his magnificent treat, reserved for Mr. Farley. Steve set the bag on the porch, took out a lighter, and set it ablaze. The rest of us launched an entire carton of eggs at the house one by one, and then started running back toward the car. As we were running, I turned to look over my shoulder, and saw Farley open his front door, look down at the flaming bag, and then just turn his head in our direction and stare. He didn't bother with the flaming bag. He let it burn. He knew what this was. A few seconds later, I took another look over my shoulder to see Farley's shadow backlit by his porch light. He jumped off the porch and ran in our direction. "Oh God, he's coming," I yelled. "What?" yelled Joey. I breathed a sigh of relief when I saw the car appear to emerge from the darkness as we ran toward it. We all jumped in and Brent started it up. As the tires were spitting up dirt and we were starting to pull away, there was a loud thud from behind. When I looked back, the rear window was splattered brown. Farley had thrown Steve's doggy bag at our rear window. Go, get out of here," Joey screamed. We fishtailed down the dirt road and sped toward freedom. "Holy," breathed Steve. "What the fuck?" added Joey. "Did he see any of our faces?" asked Brent. "I don't know," I answered. We were all silent for maybe 20 seconds. Our silence was then interrupted by a loud bang. Something hit the car. "What was that?" Brent exclaimed. I looked out the side window. Something was trailing us. "There's something out there," I said. "My dad is going to kill me. He loves this car," said Brent. "This car is a piece, dude," said Joey. "Oh, I'm sorry. Your car is so much better. Oh, that's right. You don't have one," replied Brent. I reiterated, "Guys, shut up. There's something following us." "What?" replied Joey. "I don't know. It looks like an animal or something." "Dude, we're doing 50 miles per hour. What runs that fast?" said Brent. Nobody answered. We were quiet for several minutes. "I'm done for tonight. This is crazy," said Brent, interrupting the silence. "Let's just go to the field," I said. The field was what we called the playground on my street. We would hang out there at night, for lack of other places to go. We parked the Delta and went and sat at the table that we always use. "There are huge dents in the back and the side of the car," said Brent. "That was crazy," said Steve. "That's an understatement," said Joey. "That guy's nuts," I added. "I'm dead. My dad is going to kill me when he sees that not only did I take his car without asking, but got it destroyed by some crazed lunatic," said Brent. "Okay, Cameron, I just hope he didn't identify any of us," said Joey. We sat in contemplation for a few minutes. I was staring off into the distance at nothing in particular when I noticed a shape in the darkness that appeared to be moving. "Guys, what is that?" I whispered. "What?" asked Steve. "That, over there. It's moving," I replied. Everyone turned to look. After we all started staring, the thing looked like it realized we had taken notice of it, and it started moving faster, and it was obvious that it was coming in our direction. "Run," Brent screamed. Everyone jumped up and took off toward the car. Brent attempted to get in the car to make our getaway, but it was too late. The thing was upon him as soon as he stopped running to open the door. Whatever it was on all fours. It toppled him like he was nothing. Brent let out a blood-curdling scream, which was cut off after only a split second by the thing tearing his throat out. The rest of us kept running away from the car. The three of us took cover in a backyard of one of the nearby houses. There was a barn in the back that we took shelter in, and tried to block the door by pushing a small tractor in front of it. "What are we going to do? I don't want to die," whispered Joey. "Shut up and wait for morning," replied Steve. Update. This is Joey. I'm finishing Bobby's story for him. I found this typed into his phone in the morning. He can't finish it himself, so I'm doing it to honor him. Last night in the barn, we started hearing a deep growling coming from outside. It was moving around the building and stopped in front of the door, where, whatever it was, started knocking quietly. We all sat frozen in place, trying not to even breathe. Bobby looked at us and whispered, "Shh." I stood up as quietly as possible to see if I could see anything outside of the dusty window on the side of the barn facing the door. Whatever this thing was, it was large, like some sort of animal. It was 6 feet tall, even though it was standing on all 4 legs. Steve and I climbed up to the hayloft in the barn to hide. Bobby stayed hidden on the lower level, even though we asked him to come up with us. I don't know why he stayed down there. It was then that the thing outside of the barn started speaking. In a very low, gravelly, inhuman-sounding voice, it said, "This isn't going to look good on your permanent high school record, boys. You don't want to get in trouble now, do you?" We all stayed silent. "Bobby?" it said. I don't know why he did it, but Bobby replied, "Mr. Farley?" he said. The thing laughed quietly from outside the door, then said, "I knew you'd do the right thing, Bobby. Let me in and we'll talk about this." Steve and I whispered down to Bobby, "No, shut up. Do not get up." But Bobby ignored us. I think it must have been his good nature, wanting to turn himself in and take his detention as punishment. He got up slowly and walked toward the door. "Yes, that's it. Open the door, Bobby," the thing said. Steve and I pleaded once more through whispers. "No, don't, Bobby. Stay away from the door." But we were too late. Bobby's sense of morality overtook him. He pushed the tractor out of the way and opened the door. I covered my mouth with one hand and Steve's with the other to prevent us both from accidentally making a sound. From our angle, all I could see was a large, dark shadow backlit by moonlight, staring down Bobby. The thing was not a person. It was something else. It walked slowly through the door while Bobby walked backward, matching its pace. "It's important that you find the true meaning of Devil's Night, Bobby," said the thing in its terrible voice. "This isn't about you or your friends," it continued. "It's about us. The people of this town will surely remember after tonight." And with that, it overtook Bobby. There was nothing he could do to fight it. It was over in an instant. Bobby now lay silent while the thing enjoyed its meal. After the thing finished, it moved toward the door, then stopped just before exiting, and without even looking back said in its demonic voice, "You boys make sure you're in school on Monday," and then left through the door from which it entered. Neither Steve nor I spoke a word about it until sunrise. We climbed down from the hayloft. All that was left of Bobby was his clothing and his phone. I picked up his phone and put it in my pocket. Steven and I quietly walked outside, each going our own way home. I live in a small town in northern Michigan. There really isn't very much to do, except for throwing rocks at the big fir trees around our town, late night trips to the dollar store, and hiking. Now, I don't really like hiking, but every time I meet a new girl, which is seldom as my town has quite a small population, I take her hiking. Girls think it's so romantic and intimate. It's a lot easier to get them to put out that way. My senior year of high school, I was going out with this girl Shirley. Shirley is what my friends and I called her, because if you took her out, she'd Shirley put out on the first date. It was a crisp fall day, right before snowfall. So Shirley wore my deep maroon varsity jacket and twirled her big red curls while she giggled at my quips. We played verbal chess while we jested on the likes of our graduating class and where they would all end up. Shirley ended the conversation with a curt, "Pray for the class of 14, all right, Roy?" I let out a chuckle and turned to reply when I heard something strange. It was the sound of a man coughing while also barreling down the wooded path. Let me describe just what Shirley and I were at. It was a very well-used hiking trail on the edge of town that backed up to a few of the local farms. One of the families had actually donated the land to the county as an act of altruism. Despite this, it was very desolate and nothing could be seen, save for the immense thickets and blood-orange fall leaves, bright yellow hues, and bursting piles of discarded burgundy leaves, ready for crunching. The man before us approached rapidly, so I grabbed Shirley and pulled her into the trees. As I did, the man tripped and fell right where we'd been standing. He wore hunter's clothing, that camouflage that was pictures of trees printed onto it to be photorealistic. A portly thing. The man squealed and heaved as his pustule-covered face turned blue as the depths of Lake Michigan. He was choking. "We have to help him," Shirley cried. "No, what if he could be contagious," I said, holding her tighter so she couldn't slip away. "We have to do something, Roy," she said, squirming against me, desperate to get away. I panicked, not wanting to watch this man die in front of me, but also not wanting to end up like him. I let go of Shirley. I wish I could go back and change things. I would have never let go. She ran over to him and began applying the Heimlich maneuver. While his face still strained and sweat poured down his fat face. I don't even think she was doing it right. Not that it would have mattered. I made my way further from them and pulled out my phone to call 911, but dropped it when I saw something coming out of his mouth. A long, bloodied branch ripped out of his mouth and planted itself into the ground before him and Shirley. She screamed and jolted back, but as she did, another branch bursted from the man's spine and shot into her agape mouth. Now Shirley was choking and crying, and her big brown eyes looked to me, red and bulging. I attempted to flee, but in doing so, I slipped and fell right on my ass. I noticed then that I had pissed myself. I looked at the two of them, the man face down in the dirt with a massive tree sprouting from his freshly dead corpse. Then there was Shirley. It looked like she had been pulled into the roots of this tree, as I could see her being pulled into the ground. The last thing I saw of her was her hand reaching up from the dirt before being covered by a gnarled root. I don't know why it didn't take me. Maybe I just hadn't gotten close enough, or maybe it was something else. I guess I'll never really know. Despite this, I sat there and cried, too afraid to move. You couldn't tell there had been any people there before. Just one big tree in the middle of the trail. It was clearly some kind of spruce, except it had blood-red bark like no tree I'd ever seen. This spruce would put a California redwood to shame. Eventually I got up and ran straight to my truck, where I drove like a madman to the police station. When I got there, a madman is what I looked like indeed. It didn't help that I smelled like a public restroom either. I spent the night in the drunk tank, and then made my way to my truck. Across the road from Flynn's lumber yard, and over there I saw Gabriel Jameson hawking a batch of lumber in. There are two things important about this, friends. Gabriel Jameson was the one who donated that land, and the lumber was that of a blood-red spruce. Words fail me. I don't know what to believe. I'm just going to try and preserve what happened to me. I hope by writing it down I can clear my thoughts. It was a typical day that everything happened. I had just gotten home from work and I was preparing to go through some documents in the study of a decrepit house. At the time, I was living alone in my old family home, a rackety building in an ancient neighborhood. It had been abandoned for a while. Me and my siblings had left the city in search of faraway places, and I hadn't been back there in well over a decade. My job involved travel, and so this was just a business trip. No need to rent a hotel. The house was still ours. My family had been renting it out for several years, but it was currently devoid of tenants. Except for me, that is. Imagine my surprise when I heard a voice from upstairs. "Danger." A man spoke in a harsh tone. I sat there for a moment not knowing what to do. Then I ran up the steps to the second story. There was no one. The dust in each of the rooms was undisturbed. "Who are you? Get out of my house!" I shouted. And then I heard the same voice from upstairs. "Collapse," the voice echoed. It was impossible that I had missed the intruder. There was only one staircase. I quickly ran back down to the kitchen where I knew the voice had come from. There was nothing. And then I heard the voice again. It echoed distantly. The voice was coming directly from outside the kitchen window. The problem was I was looking right at where the noise had come from, and there was nothing there. "How are you doing that?" I said. My words were shaky as I grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter. The voice spoke again, its source emanating from empty space. Harvest, Capricorn, tangerine, cannibal, vitriol. There was a door in the kitchen leading outside, and I went through it. I was now in the open air by the side of the house. I looked around for the person speaking. Still, there was no one. But then I heard a different voice. Another man. It was gentler, more calm. This time undeniably coming from an empty space in the air a short distance in front of me. "Kill the mailman." And then the voices were gone. I just sat down for a moment holding my head with my hand. This must be some stress-induced paranoia, I thought. And so I called my doctor. He'd be able to see me next week. Great, I thought in a sarcastic tone. And so I just went back to work at my old wooden desk in that decaying house of muted colors and old peeling wallpaper. The next day, though, something happened again. It was the afternoon and I had just got back from my job. I was poring through papers at my desk when I heard something. A ring of the doorbell. I went downstairs and answered it, slightly annoyed at being disturbed. There was a man outside. He had an almost sickly appearance about him. His pale skin appeared feverish. He was a guy with severe black hair and a beard. He was a mailman. He looked at me and barely whispered a few words in a soft, vehement voice. "Package for you." He took something out from behind his back and presented it to me. It was an unwrapped wooden box, old and decayed. I stared at the strange mail carrier for a moment before I took it. There was no return address or any information of any kind with it. "Thanks," I said as I took the package from his hands. The man stayed there staring at me as I closed the door in front of him. The house was silent as I took the box towards the kitchen, sat it down on the kitchen counter, and opened it. Inside there was some paper, sheets of dirty printing paper covered in messy black handwriting. There were no words on the scraps, just English letters randomly arranged to look like words. It looked like an incomplete parody of what a letter should look like. There were little images in the corners that looked like they were meant to be stamps, but they were just drawn on in ink. I went back out to the door to ask the mailman about the box, but he was gone. There was no one there. I turned around to head back, but the minute I did, I heard the doorbell ring again. I went back. I opened the door. It was another mail carrier. This time, it was a woman. She had wispy brown hair and her eyes were different colors. One was bright green, the other was deep blue. She looked past my shoulder and inside my house. "Package for you," she yelled at me. I was taken aback, but something else that confused me was that she wasn't holding a package, but then she reached behind her back and pulled away a parcel that was dripping red liquid. "Package for you," she yelled again, shoving the thing towards me. The parcel fell into my hands. It was damp. "What is this?" I asked. But just then I blinked and I was in my kitchen. I didn't remember walking here. The room was full of people, polite guests walking around and chatting. There was a party. For a moment I was confused beyond belief, but then something strange happened. My thoughts changed. It was as if everything was fine and that was how things were always meant to be. Of course, how could I forget the party? I thought. The party, of course. Of course the party. I stood up and went to go chat with my guests. The vibrant red wallpaper looked beautiful with the newly varnished hardwood. I chatted with my guests. Pointless and delightful words I seemed to have forgotten. But the more I spoke and the more I walked around my house, the more I thought something was wrong. I held a cup in my hand. It was made of bone. Beautiful, polished ivory. My chandelier was made of bone also. Many bones interlocking together. And so was my table, and so was my lamp, and so were the chairs. Hundreds of bones lined up beautifully to form magnificent furniture. Why, how lovely. How stylish, I thought. I can't say I remembered buying them, but oh, how fashionable they looked. The human femurs provided great support. They were an incredibly useful material. I glanced out the window. The sky was an orange-crimson color, and at that moment the world above appeared to be caving in. Pieces of the sky were falling to earth. Delightful, I thought. And then I heard a voice from far away. One of the voices I had heard before. The voice I remembered hearing so long ago. "Something's wrong," it said. "The guests. Look at the guests." I stood there for a moment, puzzled. And then I saw it. The guests were eating each other. Daintily and carefully, with little forks occasionally, they just seemed to take a piece out of each other and eat it. They did it playfully and with little laughs as they stole little chunks of flesh. No one bled, but they were all covered in little red marks. And I realized so was I. I screamed and threw my hands in front of me. And then suddenly I wasn't in my kitchen. I was at my front porch and I had just tossed the mail carrier's package onto the floor. The damp red parcel hit the concrete path with a thud. The mail carrier looked at me, disappointed. "Didn't you like it?" she said. "I think we should go back." She stepped towards me. I backed away. She stepped forward more, advancing into my house. I stared for a second at her, then I ran. I dashed through the hall of my house and into my kitchen. I ran to the kitchen door. I pulled the doorknob. Then I realized in horror that the kitchen door was gone. The kitchen wall had stretched over the space where it should have been. The tiled pattern looked as if it had been elongated to cover the space, dragged and fitted as if made of clay, blocking the exit so nothing but the doorknob remained. The rest was buried behind the stretched tile. And then I realized the same had happened with the windows. They were gone, covered by the stretched and distorted wall. There was only one place left to go. I ran upstairs. After a mad dash, I slammed the door of my office behind me and pushed the old wooden desk in front of it. I armed myself with an old chair leg I broke off from the seat that had been at my desk. Then I heard it. Something sounded on the other side of the study door I had just barricaded. The ring of a doorbell. I heard a raspy, screeching voice from the other side. "I have a package for you." The door began to shake. Violently, it moved in a repeating rhythm. Someone was hitting it from the other side with something heavy. I saw wood splinter near the hinges. I went to escape out the second-story window, but just like the first floor, the walls had stretched and elongated to make it non-existent. But then I heard the voice I had heard before. I heard it in my head, loud and ringing. Thoughts not my own. Kill the mailman. "It's possible. Just don't touch another parcel," the voice said. And then the door broke, and behind it, there wasn't a human. There was a thing. A vague approximation of what a human looked like, but not quite. No feature or proportion had been captured quite well. It was a twisted, horrific caricature of a person. On its face, there was a row of giant square teeth below two massive plate-sized eyes. I charged at it, jabbing the splintered chair leg into one of its eyes. It screamed and lunged at me. A scratch ripped open my arm, but I kept fighting. I stabbed and bashed, and was cut and was maimed, but I didn't stop. I kept on stabbing it, painting the room bright scarlet in terrible splatters. The violent combat took everything I had, and I never stopped, even as the pain overwhelmed my thoughts. And then eventually I was covered in cuts and wounds and blood, but I had done it. The thing in front of me was nothing but a pile of gore on the ground, one of its massive eyes fixed forever staring at me. I sat on my knees and stared at it, the blood pooling around my legs. Why is this happening to me? I thought desperately. Why did this happen? Why? My breathing was erratic as I sat unmoving. But then that voice in my head spoke again, a calm and distant tone, contemplative and peaceful. I'll never forget what it said. "The base nature of reality, of your world, is collapsing. True reality is a place as close to hell as can be made. In this place, nightmarish things beyond your imagination feast. Havens were built to escape them, but now they're all crashing down, disintegrating, falling, failing. The defenses are gone. My haven was destroyed, but it was once like yours." I sat there in silence as the voice spoke, not daring to speak, not daring to think. "You have some time before it all breaks completely, but know this. Holes in the fabric of everything will start appearing, and soon they will start leaking through. Small encounters at first, like this one, but eventually, the end begins." The voice paused for a moment. "Make of this information what you will. I have others to help, others to warn. I wish you luck." And then the voice was gone. Gone from my head and gone from my life. The walls around me had fixed themselves. There were windows again. The corpse of the mail carrier in front of me was gone, replaced by nothing but a stack of scattered envelopes. It's been several weeks since that happened, but now I can tell. I can see them. Weak points in the whole of everything. The realm outside bleeding through. I can tell they're there. Watching, waiting, devouring. just beyond vision, just beyond reach, hiding until just the right moment when they can sneak into our world.